The winter of 1735 brought with it a cold that seemed to settle not merely upon the land, but into the very bones of those who dared venture beyond the safety of established settlements. It was in the waning days of November when our small party assembled in Burlington, preparing for a journey that would take us deep into the heart of the Pine Barrens, a wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction, a place where civilization had barely made its mark upon the ancient forest. We were 5 souls bound together by commerce and necessity. Mr. Edmund Hargreaves, a gentleman of considerable ambition if modest means, had acquired a deed to land near the Mullica River. His vision was grand: timber for shipbuilding, a mill, perhaps even a port where vessels might anchor and trade. He had hired me, Thomas Ashford, as surveyor, to map the boundaries of his new domain and establish the markers by which his claim might be legitimized. The work was honest, the pay fair, and I had no reason to suspect that our expedition would become anything other than a routine exercise in measurement and documentation. Our guide was a local man named Mullen Price, weathered and silent, who knew the sand roads and hidden paths through the wilderness. He carried a staff of hickory wood, worn smooth by years of use, and his eyes held the careful watchfulness of one who had learned to read the forest's subtle signs. Owen Rees, a Welsh carpenter with broad shoulders and a temperament that could turn sharp without warning, would handle our team of horses and the wagon that carried our supplies. And finally, there was Mistress Ruth Lanning, a widow of perhaps 50 years, traveling to her sister's home near Leeds Point. We had agreed to see her safely through the wilderness, as no woman should travel such roads alone. So, before we continue, please make sure to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. The morning we departed, frost still clung to the grass, and our breath hung visible in the cold air. The wagon creaked under the weight of provisions: salted pork, hard bread, a chest of iron nails destined for the forge at Batstow, surveying equipment, muskets, powder, and shot. The horses, 2 sturdy beasts accustomed to hard labor, stamped their hooves and exhaled plumes of white vapor. The sky above was pale, promising neither sun nor storm, merely the gray indifference of late autumn. We left Burlington just after dawn, following the old ferry road eastward before turning on a narrower tracks that wound through increasingly dense forest. The pines stood close together, their trunks dark and straight, their needles carpeting the ground in a thick mat that muffled our footsteps. The wheels of our wagon cut deep ruts in the sandy soil, and the horses labored with each mile, their muscles straining against the harness. The silence of the forest was profound. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the stillness that lay over everything like a shroud. Mullen walked ahead of the wagon, his staff tapping the ground rhythmically, testing for soft spots where the earth might give way beneath our weight. Owen drove with steady hands, occasionally muttering to the horses in Welsh, words I could not understand, but whose meaning seemed clear enough. Encouragement, reassurance, perhaps a prayer. Mistress Lanning sat in the back of the wagon, wrapped in a heavy woolen shawl, her face composed but watchful. She was not a woman given to idle conversation, but when she did speak, her words carried weight. There was something in her bearing that commanded respect, a quiet strength that even Owen, with his quick temper, seemed to recognize. By mid-morning, we had traveled perhaps 8 miles, crossing several shallow streams where water ran brown with iron and tannin, staining the sand a rusty orange. The smell was sharp and mineral, tinged with the scent of decay from the bogs that lay hidden amongst the trees. I took measurements at regular intervals, marking trees with my axe, noting landmarks in my journal, calculating distances and angles that would later allow me to draw an accurate map of our route. We encountered a charcoal burner near midday, a solitary figure tending a smoldering mound of wood and earth. His hands were blackened with soot, his face obscured by a cap pulled low. Mullen spoke with him briefly, and the man warned us that the bog at Quaker Bridge had claimed a cart the previous week. He advised Mistress Lanning not to pass through Leeds Point after darkness fell, though he offered no explanation for this warning. She thanked him with grace, remarking that she had walked these roads as a girl and had family waiting for her still. The charcoal burner pointed eastward with the handle of his rake when Owen inquired about timber. "Plenty to be had," he said, his voice rough from smoke and solitude. "But mind the ground. It's not as firm as it appears." He returned to his work without another word, and we continued on our way. The afternoon brought no warmth despite the passage of hours. We stopped briefly to eat a cold meal of pork and bread, washing it down with cider that had begun to turn sharp. Mr. Hargreaves rode behind us on a small mare, a recent purchase he had made for a price he considered advantageous. He spent much of the journey surveying his surroundings with the air of a man taking inventory of his possessions, making notes beneath his cloak about potential mill sites and timber yields. His optimism struck me as somewhat premature. We had not yet reached his land, nor had we confirmed the boundaries described in his deed. The road, such as it was, had deteriorated to little more than two parallel ruts with a ridge of brush growing between them. The forest pressed in from both sides, the trees seeming to lean towards us as we passed. I continued my measurements, marking trees at intervals, but I found myself growing increasingly uneasy. The sameness of the landscape was disorienting. Every tree looked much like the last, every patch of sand indistinguishable from the previous mile. I forced myself to count steps between markers, to focus on the tangible work of surveying, to resist the vague sense of unease that had begun to settle over me. We reached a clearing before dusk, a rough oval of open ground perhaps 30 yards across. At one end stood the remains of a shed, its roof collapsed, its boards weathered gray. A ring of stones marked where someone had once maintained a fire. Mullen declared we would camp there for the night. The horses were unhitched and given feed whilst Owen built a small fire, carefully selecting dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. Mistress Lanning sliced thin portions of pork and warmed them over the flames. The men spoke in low voices about the road ahead, about stream crossings and potential difficulties. I sat somewhat apart, updating my journal by firelight, finding comfort in the precision of numbers and measurements. Mathematics did not care about isolation or the gathering darkness. Equations remained true whether calculated in a London parlor or a wilderness clearing. Night fell with startling suddenness, as it does in the forest where the canopy blocks the lingering twilight. Our small fire created a bubble of light that extended perhaps 10 feet in every direction, illuminating the rough circle of our camp and the first rank of tree trunks beyond. Past that, there was only blackness, a darkness so complete it seemed to possess weight and substance. We heard water running somewhere beyond the collapsed shed. A fox barked once in the distance, then fell silent. Mullen shared a brief account of a man who had ventured into a cranberry bog and sunk to his waist before managing to pull himself free. "Test the ground before you trust it," he advised. "Watch for moss growing over black water. That's where the bog lies waiting." Owen remarked sourly that every part of this country looked equally treacherous to him. Mistress Lanning replied that sameness often concealed important signs, and that we should train our eyes to notice small differences. It was good advice, though I wondered what signs we might be missing even as she spoke. Near midnight, as we sat around the dying fire, a sound pierced the darkness that made every one of us freeze. It was high and thin, sustained for perhaps 3 or 4 seconds before cutting off abruptly. The tone was unlike anything I had heard before, not the cry of a fox, nor the call of an owl, nor any bird or beast I could identify. It seemed to come from no specific direction, as though the forest itself had given voice to something ancient and strange. We sat in absolute silence, scarcely daring to breathe. Owen's hand moved towards the fire, as if seeking reassurance from its light. Mullen stood slowly, gripping his staff like a weapon. Mr. Hargreaves opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it. The horses shifted nervously, pulling at their tethers, their ears laid back. Long minutes passed. The sound did not return. Eventually, we settled back into our positions, though sleep would not come easily. I told myself it must have been some bird I did not know, some creature native to these woods whose call was unfamiliar to my ear. But even as I formed this rational explanation, a deeper part of my mind rejected it. There had been something fundamentally wrong about that sound, something that spoke not of animal behavior, but of something else entirely. I slept fitfully, wrapped in my cloak, my surveying chain pulled close as though its metal links might offer some protection. I woke twice during the night to the sound of the horses moving restlessly, the creak of the wagon settling, the soft exhalation of the dying fire. Each time, I lay perfectly still, listening to the darkness, waiting for the sound to return. It did not. Dawn arrived gray and cold, bringing with it a thin layer of frost that coated every surface with delicate crystals. The boards of the collapsed shed gleamed silver in the weak light, and the grass at the clearing's edge looked as though it had been dusted with fine white powder. The horses had pulled hard against their tethers during the night, leaving deep gouges in the earth where their hooves had pawed and stamped. I rose stiffly, my joints protesting the cold and the hard ground. My first task was to walk a circuit of the clearing, partly to restore circulation to my legs, partly from a surveyor's instinct to examine the ground whilst the light was good. What I discovered sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. Tracks crossed the clearing, running from the treeline to a point near the collapsed shed before terminating abruptly at a rotted stump. They were cloven, like those of a deer or goat, but the spread was far too wide, and the stride between prints was impossibly long. I paced the distance, 12 feet from one deep impression to the next, with fainter marks in between suggesting a gait unlike any animal I knew. I called Mullen and Owen over. Mullen knelt beside one of the clearer prints, running his finger along its edge. The ground was hard with frost, holding the shape well. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Owen muttered, "Deer," but without conviction. I pointed out that the stride was wrong, that no deer could cover such distance in a single bound, that the depth of the impression suggested enormous weight. We stood there in the cold morning, 3 men staring at tracks that should not exist, each of us reluctant to voice the questions forming in our minds. What creature could leave such marks? How had it approached without waking us? And perhaps most disturbing of all, where had the tracks ended? There was no return path, no trail leading away from the clearing. The creature, whatever it was, had simply vanished. Mistress Lanning approached and examined the tracks without stepping into their line. She asked quietly if we had heard the sound again during the night. We had not. She nodded slowly and said only we should keep moving. Mr. Hargreaves arrived last, peering at the tracks with a frown. He instructed me to note the date and location in my journal, then declared that we had work to do and little time to waste on mysterious tracks. His tone was brusque, almost dismissive, but I detected an edge of unease beneath his words. He was a practical man, uncomfortable with phenomena that defied easy explanation. Before we departed, I made one final examination of the collapsed shed. The interior was dim and musty, thick with the smell of rotting wood and damp earth. On one wall, still standing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Deep parallel scratches running vertically down the boards, starting for a height of perhaps 9 or 10 feet. The wood was pale where it had been scored, indicating the marks were relatively fresh. No man could reach that height without a ladder, and we had seen no ladder amongst the ruins. I did not call the others to see this. Something told me that spreading this particular discovery would serve no purpose beyond increasing our collective unease. Instead, I committed the sight to memory and returned to the wagon, resolving to watch the trees more carefully as we traveled. Our progress that day was poor. The road split and rejoined without any clear indication of which path saw more traffic. Mullen chose by instinct and experience, occasionally kneeling to examine the sand, sometimes simply standing still and seeming to taste the air like a hound seeking a scent. He kept us on the inland route, away from the salt marshes. I attempted to maintain my surveying work, taking bearings when the overcast sky permitted, measuring distances, marking trees. But my attention was divided now, my gaze drawn repeatedly to the forest around us, searching for movement, for shapes that did not belong, for signs of whatever had circled our camp in the darkness. We crossed a stream where iron oxide had stained the sand a deep rusty red. The horses drank deeply, and brown water dripped from their muzzles when they raised their heads. Mistress Lanning washed a cooking pot in the stream, holding it up to examine the fine sediment that remained inside. She frowned but said nothing. Owen showed me one of the iron nails from the chest we carried, commenting that the forge master at Batstow would appreciate the quality. As he spoke, my gaze drifted past him to a branch about 8 feet above the ground. The limb had been broken recently. Sap still glistened at the splintered end, and the wood showed white where bark had been torn away. The branch was thick, requiring considerable force to break it. Yet there were no other signs of damage nearby, no indication of what might have caused such destruction. By late afternoon, we came upon a small farmstead. No smoke rose from the chimney, and the fence surrounding the property had fallen into disrepair. A single pig lay in the pen, motionless on its side. Owen called out a greeting. No answer came. We waited at the gate, exchanging uncertain glances. Something about the silence felt wrong. Not merely the absence of response, but a quality of emptiness that suggested abandonment. Finally, Mistress Lanning asked to examine the pig. Its throat had been torn open. The wound was clean and deep, inflicted with such force that the animal would have died almost instantly. Around the pen, the sand was torn and churned, marked with depressions and scrapes that held no clear shape. Whatever had killed the pig had been large and violent, but the tracks defied interpretation. Mullen looked towards the house, raising his palm to signal we should approach no closer. He speculated that the owners had likely sought shelter with neighbors or at the mill, and that we lacked time to investigate further. We left a stick propped across the gate to show that someone had passed, then continued on our way. None of us spoke of what we were thinking, but I knew we all shared the same dark thoughts. The dead pig, the torn earth, the abandoned homestead. These were not the work of wolves or bears. Something else moved through these woods, something powerful and deliberately violent. Dusk caught us still a mile from Quaker Bridge. Rather than risk the bog and failing light, Mullen led us to higher ground where scrub oak and small pines provided some shelter. We made camp with minimal preparation, everyone moving with practiced efficiency born of exhaustion and unspoken fear. I kept the fire modest, more for comfort than warmth, and positioned my bedroll close to the wagon wheel. The night settled around us with oppressive weight. We heard an owl. We heard the distant splash of something entering water. Then we heard the cry again, that thin, high wail that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the chest. It was closer this time, and more sustained. The sound rose, held for an impossibly long duration, then cut off as though a hand had closed over the source. Owen swore quietly. Mullen stood facing the darkness, his body tense, his staff gripped in both hands. Mr. Hargreaves lay with eyes open, pretending to sleep. Mistress Lanning sat up and placed her hand on my arm, not squeezing, not speaking, simply maintaining contact, as though to confirm we were both still present in this nightmare. I began counting in my head, 1, 2, 3, for trying to impose order on chaos through the simple progression of numbers. I had not reached 20 when a shape passed overhead, silhouetted against the marginally lighter sky between two pine crowns. It moved with extraordinary speed, the line of a long body and the angle of wings clear for just an instant before it vanished. No sound accompanied its passage. No leaves rustled. The air remained still. I found myself standing without conscious decision, drawn toward the edge of our firelight by some compulsion I could not name. Immediately I felt exposed, vulnerable, wrong. I returned quickly to the wagon wheel, pulse racing, telling myself we would leave before dawn. We broke camp whilst darkness still held, the fire reduced to barely glowing embers. Mullen led with his staff, keeping to the center of the ruts where the sand provided the firmest footing. The horses moved without enthusiasm, but also without resistance, as though they too understood the necessity of progress. Our breath showed in short white bursts. I counted paces to steady my mind, keeping my journal closed and tucked safely away. Owen checked the harness repeatedly, muttering about the left trace. Mr. Hargreaves rode close behind the wagon, occasionally tapping the chest of nails with his boot as if to reassure himself of its continued presence. Mistress Lanning kept her shawl drawn tight, her eyes fixed on the tree lean to our right. As gray light began to seep into the eastern sky, the road descended towards lower ground. The air took on the sour smell of bog water, that particular combination of vegetable decay and standing water that characterizes wetlands. The trees thinned briefly, then closed in again, their roots visible above the waterlogged soil. Through morning mist, we saw Quaker Bridge, a narrow span of planks with crude railings set on either side. The stream below moved slowly, its surface covered with a brown scum that tore when disturbed. The far bank rose slightly, looking firmer than the approach. Mullen tested each plank with his staff before allowing the wagon to advance. He instructed us to keep to the center and not to stop once the team set foot on the bridge. Owen climbed down and walked at the horses' heads, speaking to them in a low, constant stream of Welsh that seemed to calm their nerves, if not his own. I took position beside the wagon to help steady it. The planks creaked ominously under our weight, uneven joints causing the wheels to bump and jolt. We were perhaps halfway across when the cry came again, the same piercing wail, but stretched longer as though something pulled a cord past its breaking point. The horses threw their heads back, lips curling to show teeth, eyes rolling white. Owen maintained his grip on the bridle, his voice dropping to an even flatter register, somehow conveying calm through sheer force of will. I matched his pace, not looking up, not allowing myself to be distracted by the sound that seemed to vibrate in the very planks beneath our feet. The cry ended. Silence rushed in to fill the void, a silence that rang in my ears and made the world seem suddenly hollow. We reached the far bank and rolled onto sand. Only then did any of us allow ourselves to breathe fully. The road followed the stream for some distance on the far side of Quaker Bridge. The ground swallowed sound, making each footfall seem muffled and distant. We moved at a cautious pace, Mullen leading with increasing urgency, no longer pausing at intersections or consulting landmarks. Near a stand of cedar trees, he stopped suddenly and raised his hand. On the trunk of the nearest tree, perhaps 10 feet above the ground, were 4 parallel grooves. They were clean and deep, cutting through bark into the pale wood beneath. Resin had begun to weep from the wounds, but had not yet hardened. Mullen placed his palm against the trunk below the marks, then examined the ground. The moss was torn, showing dark earth beneath, but no clear tracks remained. He stood silently for a long moment before instructing Owen to water the horses briefly, then move on without delay. We followed the stream to a shallow ford, then turned inland. The road climbed to higher ground, offering a view across scrub oak and a pale flat that caught what little sunlight penetrated the clouds. The light brought no warmth, no comfort, only a cold illumination that made the emptiness of the landscape more apparent. We discovered a small hut constructed of cedar poles near where someone had been harvesting peat. A rake leaned against the door, rusted and abandoned. Our calls received no answer. Inside, we found a low bed with a faded blanket, a table with a tin cup and a loaf of bread gone hard as stone. A page torn from a ledger bore 3 lines in a hurried hand. Noise at night, go to Tom's River back before thaw. Mullen placed the page back where it had lain, examined the roof line, then walked behind the hut. The sand there showed a broad, shallow depression without clear edges, as though something of considerable weight had descended from above and then lifted straight up again. The shape matched no animal track I had ever studied. Mistress Lanning stood in the doorway and spoke without turning. She said the sound we had heard was the same she had encountered near Leeds Point when she was a girl. She said the older men had gone out with lanterns and returned without speaking to anyone. She had not slept for 2 nights afterwards, and her father had moved the family inland the following spring. She offered no further explanation, but the weight of her words hung over us. This was not a new phenomenon. Whatever moved through these woods had done so for decades, perhaps longer. and those who encountered it learned quickly that silence was the wisest response. Owen looked to Mr. Hargreaves as though seeking permission to abandon our mission. Mr. Hargreaves set his jaw and declared that the forge expected delivery of the nails, and that his deed required a proper survey, not tales and speculation. His words sounded hollow, even as he spoke them, but they served their purpose. We continued forward. By late afternoon, the smell of bog water intensified. We reached a stream crossing where a fallen log served as a makeshift causeway. The process of getting our wagon across proved arduous. We unloaded half our supplies, carried the chest of nails to the far side, and returned for the remainder. The horses refused the log initially, requiring Owen's patient coaxing to convince them to attempt the crossing one at a time. When the wagon's turn came, the rear wheel slipped and sank to the hub in dark water. We worked the lever under the axle, straining and sweating despite the cold, until finally the wheel came free and we could haul the wagon across. As we reloaded our supplies, a shadow passed over the water's surface, breaking the scum into rippling patterns. Mistress Lanning raised her eyes briefly, then lowered them again. No one spoke of what we had seen, or rather, what we had sensed just beyond the edge of sight. The trees grew thicker as we progressed. A cold emanated from the shade that seemed unconnected to mere absence of sunlight. We passed a series of shallow pits arranged in a grid, rimmed with moss and scattered brick, the remains of old bog iron excavations, long since worked out and abandoned. The ground between the pits proved firmer than the surrounding terrain, and we followed this higher path with relief. Near dusk, we discovered a low building of clapboard construction with a shed behind it and a modest stack of cordwood to one side. No smoke rose from the chimney. A piece of cloth hung from a nail near the door, faded and still. Mullen called out, identifying us by name. No answer came. He lifted the simple peg latch and pushed the door open, the wood scraping across the threshold. Inside, the air held the smell of tallow and something sharper, harder to identify. White ash filled the hearth. On the table lay a small book bound in pasteboard. The first page contained dates and brief notes in a careful hand. Child ill cow strayed, heard it again. The final line read simply, "It knows the roof." Above the table, the rafters showed evenly spaced holes, not from insects, but torn through from above. The edges were splintered, showing fresh pale wood. A spot of dried brown substance stained one roof seam, small but unmistakable. Owen traced one of the splits with his finger and swore softly. He suggested a storm had caused the damage. Mullen disagreed, pointing out that storms did not create such precise holes from beneath a roof. He closed the book gently and set it down. Mistress Lanning ran her finger along the spine without looking at the pages directly. She observed that the owner had left in considerable haste and might yet return. We decided to leave a small bundle of food on the table with a note bearing our names and the date. Then we barred the door from inside and agreed to maintain a watch throughout the night. The first watch fell to Owen and myself. We sat near the cold hearth without lighting a fire, conserving our wood and avoiding any sign that might draw attention. The night settled around the house with gathering weight. Sounds began small, a branch settling, a strip of bark loosening, the slow drip of water from the eaves. Then came something else, a light sound from above, as though something had placed weight carefully upon the roof, then withdrawn it. I looked at Owen. He stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched. The sound came again from the opposite side of the roof. Then a slow scrape moved along the ridge, deliberate and cautious. It stopped directly above the door. We heard the latch lift fractionally before falling back. The peg held. The scraping returned, moving above the table, then the hearth, then to the far corner where rafters met beam. It stopped. A breath came through the seam between boards, a slow inhalation that seemed to test the air inside our shelter. My chest tightened in involuntary response. The breathing ceased. Time stretched. Then from a yard outside came a sound that made every hair on my body stand erect. The cry again, close and short like a test or a question. Another sound answered from farther away, lower and rougher, as though not entirely shaped for vocalization. We woke the others without speaking. Mr. Hargreaves sat up, his expression one of poorly concealed fear. Mullen took his staff and moved to the window. Mistress Lanning stood near the door with her hands clasped together, not in prayer, but in an effort to steady herself. The roof creaked once more. Something moved down the outside wall, nails or claws clicking softly against clapboard at measured intervals. The footsteps reached the ground and stopped. The window showed only our own pale faces reflected in the glass. We waited in breathless silence. Then came 3 light taps at the door, deliberate, precise, utterly unlike any human knock. Owen whispered that we should answer. Mullen shook his head emphatically, pointing to the peg that barred our entrance. The taps came again, same pattern, same spacing. They stopped. A smell reached us through the cracks. Iron and old decay, sharp enough to sting the nostrils. It filled the room for a moment, then faded as mysteriously as it had come. The silence that followed possessed tangible weight. I could hear the faint scratch of Mistress Lanning's thumb rubbing against her palm. Mr. Hargreaves whispered that we should not be imprisoned by tricks, and that fear would prevent us from completing our mission. No one answered him. The quiet shattered with a sudden rush across the roof, a crosswise run from corner to corner, followed by a heavy impact behind the house, as though something large had dropped from the eaves. The horses screamed from the shed, the sound choking off not into silence, but into harsh breathing and the scrape of hooves against posts. We unbarred the door and rushed out into the yard. The cold air struck my face like a physical blow, shocking my senses into sharp clarity. Owen carried the lantern, its weak light showing the nearest horse backed into a corner, eyes rolling, rope twisted around a support beam. The other horse pressed against the opposite wall, coat dark with sweat, entire body trembling. The shed's rear door hung open on a broken hinge. The boards along its edge bore those now familiar parallel grooves, deep, close together, positioned far too high for any man to reach without assistance. The marks were fresh, the wood pale against the weathered gray. We brought both horses out into the open yard and walked them until their breathing eased. I ran my hands along their flanks, feeling raised welts where hair had been torn away. The wounds were not deep, but they proved that something had made physical contact with the animals. Mullins circled the shed once with the lantern, returning without speaking. His silence conveyed more than words could have. We had all seen what he had discovered. The tracks that never held clear form, the disturbed sand, the sense of enormous weight passing without leaving definitive evidence. We did not sleep that night. We barred the house again and sat with muskets loaded and primed. The lantern burned low. The roof remained silent. The cry did not return. In the thin hours before dawn, my eyes closed for what felt like mere seconds. When I opened them, the room was unchanged, but my mind had filled the darkness with impossible shapes. When gray light finally seeped through the windows, we prepared to leave immediately. I added a line to our note: roof not sound. Advise repairs and caution. We hitched the team and departed without eating. On the road, Mullen announced we would cut south to the Batstow track and follow it directly to the forge without further stops. His tone brooked no argument. No one objected. The morning remained gray and oppressive, with thin wind hissing through the pine tops. The track narrowed and bent frequently, forcing us to weave between trees that seemed to lean inward from both sides. Mullen explained that this road was older than it appeared, first cut by men who carried bog iron or on their backs to Batstow before better routes were established. The sand here mixed with gravel, providing firmer footing. The horses moved with less strain, though their ears continued to flick nervously at every small sound. I abandoned my surveying notes and walked beside the wagon, finding that movement helped steady my nerves. We reached a fork by mid-morning. The left path showed fresh wheel marks, the right only deer and raccoon tracks. Mullen knelt and studied both options before choosing the left route towards the forge. The smell of smoke reached us first, faint but unmistakable. Then came the sound of water rushing over stone. These ordinary sounds of human industry struck me as nearly miraculous after our days in the silent wilderness. The others visibly relaxed, their pace quickening. The road dipped once more, and the forge pond came into view through the trees, a dark sheet of water disturbed only by the mill race. Beyond it stood the forge house itself, low and wide with 2 chimneys and an open door. The hammer inside was silent. We called out and waited. A boy emerged from behind the building, no more than 12 years old, barefoot despite the cold, his face smudged with soot. Mullen spoke with him, learning that the boy's father and the other workers had gone upriver 2 days prior to fell timber and had not returned. The boy said they had heard strange sounds at night from the woods behind the slag heap. Long cries like a woman screaming, but stretched thin and impossibly high. His father had instructed him to remain close to the buildings and not to answer any calls he heard after dark. The boy pointed to a spot near the tree lean where something had burned. The sand there was black and glossy, as though heat had melted it into glass. Mullen asked if there had been a fire. The boy shook his head. It just appeared one morning when we woke. No trees nearby had burned. The air smelled of iron and wet stone. We led the wagon near the forge and unhitched the horses. Owen checked the wheels whilst Mistress Lanning went inside with what remained of our provisions, seeking a place to rest. I followed Mullen to examine the slag heap. The ground was treacherous, covered in sharp fragments of black stone that cracked underfoot. In the center of a cleared space lay the fused patch the boy had described, roughly circular, perhaps 6 feet across, with edges that had melted into the surrounding sand. A few white feathers lay trapped in cracks across its surface. Mullen knelt and touched the glassy material. It was cold and slick. He stood and wiped his hand on his coat, then declared quietly that we should leave before nightfall. His voice carried an urgency I had not heard before, and coming from a man of his experience, it sent fresh chills down my spine. We spent 2 hours unloading the nails and repacking the wagon for our return journey. The forge boy stayed nearby, but spoke little, his eyes constantly drawn to the tree lean. At one point, he asked if we had seen anything in the sky during our travels. Mullen said no. The boy nodded and explained that sometimes just before dark, something passed overhead without sound, and all the geese would rise simultaneously in panic. He said it never came from the same direction twice. When Owen asked if anyone had tried shooting at it, the boy's expression grew haunted. He said his uncle had fired once at a shape crossing the moon. The musket barrel had split, nearly taking the man's hand with it. We departed before the light failed, retracing our route with increased urgency. The mist rose from the pond as we left, and the air grew still in that peculiar way that precedes storms. Yet no storm came, only that heavy, expectant silence. As we passed the first bend, I heard the cry behind us, distant and thin, drawn out across space rather than height. Mullen did not turn. He instructed us to keep the team steady and not to stop until the trees thinned. We maintained a steady pace, the wagon wheels grinding through sand and gravel. The sound came again, closer now and sharper, ending in a low trill that made the horses toss their heads and pull against their harness. Owen struck the reins with more force than necessary, cursing under his breath in Welsh. I turned once, unable to resist the compulsion to look back. Movement caught my eye above the tree lean, a dark shape gliding with wings half-folded, turning in a slow arc against the gray sky. It passed over the road behind us and vanished into the mist that clung to the forest canopy. The silence of its passage was somehow more disturbing than any sound would have been. We reached higher ground where the forest opened slightly and the trees stood more sparsely. Mullen stopped and raised his hand, signaling us to listen. For a moment, there was only wind moving through branches. Then came another cry, deeper and lower than the first, distinctly different in tone. It seemed to originate from the direction we had just left, from the forge. The boy had been alone there. The realization settled over me like a weight of cold iron. Mistress Lanning crossed herself silently. Mr. Hargreaves declared we had no choice but to continue. We could not return now, not with darkness approaching. Mullen agreed, though his tone carried doubt and perhaps a measure of guilt. We made camp that night on elevated ground near a stand of scrub oak, the highest point we could find in this flat wilderness. We built no fire. The horses grazed on dry grass and remained close to the wagon of their own accord, as though they understood that proximity to humans offered some measure of protection, however illusory. Owen kept his musket across his knees, one hand always resting on the stock. Mistress Lanning sat with her shawl drawn up, eyes fixed on the darkness that surrounded our small circle. Mullen stood apart, facing the direction from which we had come, so still he might have been carved from wood. Mr. Hargreaves attempted to write in his journal by the weak light of our shuttered lantern, but the words seemed to bring him no comfort. I could see his hand trembling slightly as he formed each letter. I lay with my back against the wagon wheel and watched the sky. Cloud cover obscured the stars, creating a uniform darkness overhead. Then, for just a moment, a faint glow pulsed on the horizon, low and slow, like sheet lightning, but without the characteristic flicker. Mullen saw it as well. He stated quietly that it was not lightning. No thunder followed. Near midnight, the horses started. Their heads came up simultaneously, ears forward, nostrils flared. A smell reached us on the still air, sharp and sour, a combination of wet iron and organic decay that seemed to coat the inside of my throat. Owen stood with a musket raised to his shoulder, sighting along the barrel into darkness. The sound that came next stopped all movement, all thought, all breath. It was a slow, dragging inhalation, as though something enormous drew air through the trees, testing for scent. The breathing moved around our position in a wide circle, growing louder, then softer, then louder again. Mullen motioned urgently for us to remain low and silent. We heard a branch snap somewhere in the darkness, the sharp crack of wood under tremendous pressure. Another breath followed, closer now, right at the edge of where a lantern light would have reached if we had dared to unshutter it. The silence that followed was not empty but full, pressed down upon us until I felt it as physical pressure against my chest. I counted breaths without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4. The counting gave my mind something to hold on to. A faint scraping sound came from behind the wagon. Owen pivoted, musket following his movement, and fired. The muzzle flash lit the forest for a single brilliant instant. In that frozen moment of illumination, I saw something at the very edge of the light. Not a complete shape, but a surface like dark leather catching the flash, something large and wrong, angular where it should have been curved, present where nothing should have been. Then darkness returned, more absolute than before. The sound that followed the gunshot was not a cry, but a burst of expelled air, high and sharp, cutting off halfway through as though whatever made it had decided silence was preferable. The horses broke their tethers and ran. The sudden violence of their departure was shocking. They simply bolted into the darkness with a thunder of hooves, driven by terror beyond any control we might have exercised. The wagon jerked forward, tilting dangerously, nearly overturning. Owen shouted, but his words were lost in chaos. Mullen grabbed the chest of nails and threw it clear of the wagon before it could be lost. The wagon tipped, spilling half our remaining supplies into the sand before settling back onto its wheels with a groan of stressed wood. When stillness returned, it was complete. The forest had gone utterly silent. Even the wind had ceased. The smell lingered in the air, that combination of metal and rot that now seemed to mark the presence of whatever hunted us. I looked to where the musket flash had briefly illuminated the trees. The sand there was disturbed in a wide circle, pressed flat in a way that suggested enormous downward force. A single deep mark cut across the edge of the depression, cloven, larger than any deer track, extending for a short distance before terminating abruptly, as though the creature had lifted into the air mid-stride. Mullen stared at the mark without speaking. Owen reloaded his musket with shaking hands, fumbling with powder and shot, nearly dropping the ramrod twice. Mistress Lanning's gaze remained fixed on the spot where the flash had revealed that glimpse of something impossible. Mr. Hargreaves stood with his journal half open, staring at a blank page as though he had forgotten what words were for. None of us slept. We sat in silence, waiting for dawn with the patience of condemned prisoners awaiting execution. When gray light finally began to seep into the eastern sky, it revealed scattered supplies, the tilted wagon, and the disturbed sand that showed clearly what had stood among us in the darkness. We gathered what we could salvage and began walking east, abandoning the wagon and the hope of recovering our horses. Mullen led without looking back, his staff tapping the ground with metronomic regularity. No one spoke for the first hour of walking. When the trees opened slightly, affording us a view of the sky, we saw carrion birds circling high above the direction for which we had come. They moved in uneven, disturbed patterns, rising and falling as though following something below that kept startling them from their natural behavior. By midday, the character of the forest had begun to shift. The sand grew lighter in color, less iron-stained. The trees stood farther apart, allowing more light to penetrate. A faint smell of salt reached us from the east, speaking of marshes and eventually the sea beyond. The oppressive silence that had surrounded us since leaving the forge felt thinner here, though not absent. Mullen announced we were within a day's walk of Leeds Point if we maintained our pace. The prospect of reaching civilization, of rejoining the human world, seemed almost fantastical after our days in the wilderness. We stopped once to drink from a shallow creek. The water was cold and carried a bitter, metallic aftertaste that coated my tongue. Mistress Lanning remarked that it reminded her of wells near her father's farm, where the buckets sometimes emerged stained orange from iron oxide. She drank only a small amount before turning away. Owen had grown increasingly quiet. His eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion, and he walked with the musket perpetually at half-ready, as though expecting attack at any moment. He had bound a strip of cloth around the weapon's stock where the powder flash had burned his hand. Mr. Hargreaves no longer spoke of land or timber or commerce. The carefully maintained facade of the prosperous gentleman had crumbled, revealing a frightened man who followed our small group, because the alternative, being alone in these woods, was unthinkable. He glanced repeatedly between the trees and the sky, waiting for approach from either direction. Late in the afternoon, the sky thickened with gray clouds that seemed to press down upon us. The light grew weak and diffuse, creating a strange flatness that made distances difficult to judge. The trees around us were shorter now, with twisted trunks and patches of green moss clinging to their northern sides. Mullen stopped abruptly, crouching to examine marks in the sand. They were faint but discernible, a line of impressions like hooves, but with spacing far too wide for any normal gait. The ground around them showed disturbance in long streaks, as though something had used wings to break its descent. He stood silently for a long moment, then ordered us to move quickly. His voice had lost its customary calm, carrying an edge of something very close to fear. Coming from a man who had remained steady through every previous horror, this change in his demeanor was perhaps more frightening than the tracks themselves. The temperature dropped sharply. I felt a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with exertion. The forest no longer felt empty. Something else occupied this space with us, something that moved without sound, that watched without revealing itself. Ruth whispered that she could hear breathing behind her. I turned, seeing nothing but trees and gray light filtering through branches. When I looked back at her, she met my eyes with an expression that asked me to deny what she had said. I cannot. I had heard it too, faint and rhythmic, just at the edge of perception. We reached a clearing before full dusk fell. It was perhaps 50 yards across, dominated by a single dead oak at its center. The tree's bark had been stripped in patches, revealing pale wood beneath. At its base lay the carcass of what had been a deer. The body had been torn open, ribs spread wide, organs removed. The ground around it was scorched and blackened in patterns that suggested intense heat applied in specific locations. Mullen knelt for a closer examination, his face grim. He reported that the flesh was cold and dry, not fresh, yet the edges of the wounds showed no signs of decay or insect activity. The blood had dried to a dark crust, but decomposition had not begun despite what must have been at least a day's exposure. The smell was present again, iron and old death, sharp enough to make my throat constrict. Mistress Lanning turned away and began murmuring something too quiet to distinguish. Owen suggested we burn the carcass. Mullen refused, stating there was no time and that fire would attract attention we could not afford. We gave the clearing wide berth, skirting its edge rather than crossing directly. As we entered the next section of forest, the light failed with unnatural speed. The clouds overhead thickened until it felt like twilight, though my internal sense of time insisted it could not be past 5 o'clock. The temperature continued to drop. Without the horses and wagon, without most of our supplies, the cold became a genuine threat. We carried what we could on our backs: minimal food, water skins, weapons, and my surveying equipment, which I had stubbornly refused to abandon despite its weight. I heard the first clicking sound not long after, short and dry, like claws scratching on bark. Owen froze, pointing his musket towards the canopy. I could see nothing, but a pale flash of movement registered among the dark branches. Mullen ordered us to keep walking, his voice low and urgent. He said we must not stop regardless of what we heard. We obeyed, though every instinct screamed to take cover, to hide, to make ourselves small and invisible. The clicking followed us, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes directly overhead. Distance and direction became impossible to determine. Each time it stopped, I strained to hear breathing, but detected only the nearby stream and the scrape of our boots through sand. When the trees finally opened again, we found ourselves on a rise of dry ground, the first truly firm footing we had encountered in hours. Owen built a small fire despite Mullen's obvious reluctance, arguing that we needed the heat more than we needed concealment. The flames were weak and yellow, barely pushing back the darkness. Mist crept around our position, thinning near the fire but never fully retreating. Mistress Lanning sat with her knees drawn to her chest, eyes reflecting firelight, staring into darkness. She whispered that the clicking sound from the roof of the abandoned cabin had been identical to this, only slower, more deliberate. Mr. Hargreaves sat apart, the second musket across his lap, gazing into the fog with an expression of profound defeat. Mullen suggested he try to rest, but he shook his head mutely. The cry came just after the fire had burned to coals, a high, piercing wail that rose from the mist with such proximity it seemed to originate within our camp. The sound froze thought, stopped breath, paralyzed movement. It was the same pitch and duration as before, but this time it did not fade. It held beyond any reasonable lung capacity, until the air itself seemed to vibrate in sympathy. Owen lunged to his feet, raising the musket. The instant he moved, the cry cut off as though severed by a blade. Silence rushed in, profound, absolute, unnatural. Then came a rush of air that bent our fire sideways, nearly extinguishing it. The trees around us shuddered despite the absence of wind. Something passed overhead, close enough that I felt the displacement of air against my face. I saw it for perhaps 2 heartbeats, a long body with wings stretched wide, a tail that curled and straightened as it maneuvered, moving with impossible speed through gaps between branches that should have torn wings to shreds. Then it was gone, vanished into mist as though it had never existed. The fire guttered and nearly died. Mistress Lanning began whispering a prayer, the words tumbling over each other in desperate haste. Mullen took the musket from Owen's hands and stated in a voice that brooked no argument that we would not fire again unless the creature came close enough to strike. He said noise would only draw it back more aggressively. The cries sounded again, farther away now, but still circling. Each time it called, my mind involuntarily supplied the image of our lost horses, how they would have reared and screamed if they were still with us. Their absence felt like a wound, another piece of normal reality torn away. Mullen made the decision to abandon the fire and continue moving. He said remaining still made us targets. We gathered our few possessions and pushed eastward, guided by the faint suggestion of starlight that occasionally broke through gaps in the fog. My legs felt weak, but movement kept panic at bay. Behind us, something crashed through branches with a sharp crack that echoed through the forest. I forced myself not to look back. The sound of wings came again, one heavy beat, then another, then nothing. By the time gray dawn light began to filter through the trees, the forest had thinned noticeably. In the distance, I could see the outline of salt meadows, that distinctive flat expanse where trees gave way to grass and standing water. Leeds Point was perhaps 4 or 5 hours ahead if we maintained our pace. The land felt less enclosed here, less oppressive. The air carried the smell of the sea, salt and decay and life, the ordinary smells of tidal marshes. Mullen announced we would rest once we reached the dunes beyond the meadow. We stopped near a stand of dry reeds where wind moved with normal patterns, unimpeded by dense forest. The sound of it was oddly reassuring. Wind that acted as wind should, following natural laws, creating effects proportional to causes. I lay back against sand still cold from night and stared at the sky. For a brief moment, exhaustion and relief combined to create a sense that we had escaped, that the worst was behind us. Then Mistress Lanning pointed upward without speaking. Far off, just at the edge of cloud cover, a dark shape circled. Once, twice, 3 times it turned in a wide gyre. Then, with horrifying deliberation, it folded its wings and dropped straight down into the forest from which we had just emerged. No cry followed, only wind moving through reeds and the distant sound of tide. Mullen watched until the shape vanished completely, then turned towards the road that would lead us to safety. We walked the final miles in silence, each of us wrapped in private thoughts. By the time smoke from cottage chimneys came into view, twilight was gathering. The sight of human habitation, walls and roofs, tended gardens, paths worn by ordinary traffic, struck me as simultaneously miraculous and fragile. People stared as we entered Leeds Point. We were covered in sand and dirt, our clothing torn, our faces marked by exhaustion, and something less tangible that must have shone in our eyes. An old man standing outside the tavern saw Mullen and nodded in recognition. "You've come from the inland road," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Mullen replied. The old man's expression grew somber. "Then you've heard it as well." He gestured towards the forest. "It's been crying near the bogs for 3 nights running. Miller's boys saw it fly across the moon 2 nights past. We took lodging in the tavern's loft. None of us spoke much. Mr. Hargreaves attempted to write, but abandoned the effort, folding his papers and tucking them away. Owen slept with his musket within arm's reach, though sleep came only in brief, fitful intervals. Mistress Lanning kept her shawl wrapped close and did not close her eyes until dawn light crept through the loft's small window. When I finally succumbed to exhaustion, my dreams were filled with trees that bent without wind and the sound of wings scraping against bark. In the morning, we prepared to leave for Burlington. Mullen led once more, but he was changed, quieter than before, glancing upward more frequently than the path ahead required. Each time Shadow crossed our route, his hand moved to his staff and his pace quickened slightly. None of us spoke about what we had experienced. But when the town finally fell behind us and the pines closed in again, I noticed we all moved closer together, instinctively seeking the protection of proximity. The journey back took 2 days. The road felt different now, as though the forest itself had changed, had revealed something of its true nature that could not be unseen or forgotten. Every unusual sound drew our attention. Every movement in peripheral vision caused heads to turn that we never returned to that part of the Pine Barrens. The forge at Batstow was abandoned within the year, though no official explanation was given. The road we had traveled fell into disuse, gradually being reclaimed by the forest. Maps were redrawn, showing different routes that avoided the deepest parts of the wilderness. Mr. Hargreaves never pursued his claim to the land near the Mullica River. He sold his deed to another man who, to my knowledge, never attempted to survey the property. Owen Reese returned to carpentry in Burlington and refused to discuss our journey with anyone. He died some years later, still relatively young, worn down by something I always suspected was more than mere physical ailment. Mistress Lanning reached her sister safely and lived there until her death. I visited her once, perhaps 5 years after our journey. She was cordial but distant, and when I mentioned the Pine Barrens, her expression closed completely. "We saw what we saw," she said simply. "Speaking of it changes nothing." Mullen Price continued guiding parties through the wilderness, but never again on the inland routes. He kept to the coastal paths and the well-traveled roads, places where human presence was constant and the forest had been pushed back by axe and fire. He died an old man, having kept his silence about those days in November 1735. As for myself, I continued surveying for many years. My work took me through forests and swamps across the colonies, but I never encountered anything comparable to what we experienced in the Pine Barrens. I have my notes from that journey still, measurements, bearings, dates, and locations. They are precise and accurate, the work of a careful professional. But there are things my notes cannot capture. The weight of silence in a forest that should hold sound. The smell of iron and decay that preceded encounters with something that defied all natural classification. The sight of tracks that began and ended without continuity, as though whatever made them move between earth and air with equal facility. I have heard the sound in my memory countless times since, that long, thin cry that seemed to cut through all other noise, to bypass the ears entirely and resonate in the chest. I have never heard again with my physical hearing, and for that I am grateful beyond expression. But sometimes when wind runs low through trees and the forest grows still in that particular way that precedes storms, I remember how that cry rose and held and ended as if the air itself had been torn. And I remember something else, something I have never spoken of to anyone. In that brief instant when Owen's musket flash lit the forest, what I saw at the edge of illumination was not merely large or strange or frightening. What I saw was intelligent. It was watching us with purpose and awareness, studying us with an attention that was neither animal nor human, but something else entirely. That knowledge, more than any of the physical evidence or the accounts of others, has shaped my understanding of what occurred during those days. The Pine Barrens remains, vast and largely unexplored. People travel its edges, harvest its resources, build their small settlements in the clearings. But the deep forest, the oldest parts where cedar and pine grow thick and the bogs lie dark and still, those places are left alone, avoided by unspoken agreement. Because those who have ventured deep into that wilderness and return know what the rest merely suspect. There are places where the boundary between the known world and something older, something that preceded human understanding, grows thin. And in those places, something waits and watches, something that has claimed that territory as its own long before we arrived and will remain long after we are forgotten. I am an old man now, my surveying days behind me. My hands shake when I write, and my eyes grow weak. But I remember every detail of those days in November 1735 with perfect clarity. The mind does not forget such things, cannot forget them even if it wishes to. The Jersey Devil, that is what some have begun calling it now, giving name to what we encountered. The label seems inadequate, too small to contain the reality of what we experienced. But perhaps names serve a purpose, creating boundaries around things too large for human comprehension, reducing the unknown to something that can be discussed and dismissed. I do not dismiss it. I know what I saw, what we all saw, and I know that it continues still, crying out over those ancient forests, moving through darkness on wings that make no sound, hunting and watching with an intelligence that predates and transcends our understanding. Some nights, when sleep eludes me and memory rises unbidden, I wonder about the forge boy we left behind. I wonder what happened when night fell and he was alone with whatever circled those buildings, testing doors and scratching at walls. I wonder if he ran, if he hid, if he survived. But I do not wonder whether it is still there, still moving through those woods. Of that I am certain. The Pine Barrens keeps its secrets, and some secrets have teeth and wings and a cry that pierces the soul. This account I write now, in the autumn of my years, stands as the only complete record of what occurred during those days. Whether it is believed or dismissed as the fantasy of an old man's failing mind matters little to me. I have set down the truth as I experienced it, measured and recorded with the same precision I brought to every survey of my career. The wilderness remains. The creature remains. And those who venture too deep into the Pine Barrens may yet encounter what we encountered. That presence that watches from shadows, that moves between earth and sky, that calls out with a voice like tearing metal and answers to no law but its own ancient nature. I have lived a long life, have measured miles of wilderness, have charted borders and boundaries across this vast land. But I learned in November 1735 that some boundaries cannot be drawn on maps. Some territories belong to forces we can neither understand nor control, and some things that dwell in darkness should be left to their domain. This is my testimony. This is my warning. And this is the truth of what stalks the Pine Barrens, what claimed that land before we came, and will hold it long after we are dust. May those who read these words take heed, and may they choose their paths through the wilderness with wisdom born of knowledge that some places are not meant for human feet, some sounds should not be answered, and some creatures that cry in the night are best left undiscovered and unnamed.